I still remember the way the church smelled that morning, a mixture of old wood, lilies, and rain-soaked coats. My name is Daniel Carter, and that day I was walking into my grandfather's funeral. A place I had dreaded, not because of grief, but because of the people I knew I'd find there, my family. Two outsiders, the Carters looked like a picture-perfect family, the kind people envied at holiday gatherings. My grandfather, Richard Carter, had been a respected businessman, the kind who built his legacy from nothing. He was the pillar, tall, broad-shouldered, even in old age, with that deep, commanding voice that could silence a room. People in our town admired him. They thought he had raised a proud, tight-knit family. But the truth was different. Behind the closed doors of our family home, cracks had splintered long before I was even born. I grew up being the outsider among my cousins. My father, Grandpa's youngest son, died when I was 12. After that, I was more like the forgotten branch of the family tree. My mother, Elaine, did what she could, but she never quite fit into the Carter mold either. The rest of them, my uncles, aunts, and cousins, carried themselves like royalty, dripping with entitlement and superiority. There was Uncle Thomas, the eldest son, who took over the family business. He always looked at me as though I were a stray dog, tolerated only because I bore the Carter name. His wife, Margaret, had a permanent sneer etched into her face, and together they raised two children, Clara and Andrew, who followed their parents' lead, mocking me at every chance. Then there was Aunt Sylvia, the middle child, dramatic and sharp-tongued. She had two daughters, Lydia and Grace, who prided themselves on their beauty and social status. They loved reminding me that I didn't belong at the same table as them. Growing up, family gatherings meant enduring endless comments. "Daniel, is that your only suit? Looks a bit tight, doesn't it? You don't talk much. Maybe that's for the best. Your father was the dreamer, wasn't he? Such a shame. Practicality runs in the rest of us." Those words stung more than they realized. After Dad's death, I had wanted nothing more than to be accepted, to have someone take me under their wing. But instead, I became the family's punching bag, the scapegoat who reminded them of a branch of the family tree they wished they could prune. And Grandpa loved me. I knew that deep down, but he was a complicated man. He was proud, stubborn, and he rarely interfered when the rest of the family ridiculed me. Sometimes I'd catch him watching in silence, his jaw tight, eyes unreadable. Then later, he'd slip me a book or pat my shoulder, telling me, "Don't let them break you, Daniel. You're stronger than they think." I carried those words with me. Still, as I sat in the pew at his funeral, those memories were buried under layers of bitterness. The rain pattered against the stained glass windows as people shuffled in. My relatives arrived in clusters, their black clothing perfectly tailored, their expressions rehearsed with just the right amount of solemnity. Aunt Sylvia hugged Margaret with dramatic sobs while Clara and Lydia compared their designer heels in hushed whispers. I kept to myself, sitting quietly at the end of the row. My mother sat beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly. "You okay?" she whispered. "I'm fine," I said, though my stomach twisted, because I knew what was coming. Funerals weren't just about mourning in my family. They were stages, arenas, where each member fought for attention, for recognition, for approval. And without Grandpa there, I was sure the spotlight would turn crueler than ever. During the service, the pastor spoke kindly of Grandpa's achievements, his philanthropy, his leadership. Everyone nodded, dabbing their eyes with tissues. Though I couldn't help but notice the sideways glances, the quiet smirks from Clara and Andrew. When it was time for family members to share memories, Uncle Thomas rose first. His speech was polished, rehearsed. "Father was a man of vision," he declared. "He built this family, this legacy. Everything we are today, we owe to him. And we will continue to honor him through the Carter name, through strength, unity, and success." Unity. The word nearly made me choke. Aunt Sylvia followed. her voice quivering dramatically as she recounted childhood stories that painted her as the cherished daughter. Even Lydia and Grace went up, their words dripping with self-praise, barely disguised as eulogies. And then, as if rehearsed, Clara spoke. She glanced toward me as she began. "Grandfather always pushed us to be our best," she said sweetly. "He believed in excellence. He always said the Carter family should never settle for mediocrity. We should strive to be leaders, achievers. And, well, I think he would be proud of the way most of us have carried that forward." The emphasis on most wasn't lost on anyone. Laughter rippled softly through the cousins' row, muffled behind tissues. I clenched my fists. My chest burned, but I stayed seated, 'cause this was familiar. The setup to a humiliation I knew was coming, could feel it, like the tightening of a noose. That's when Uncle Thomas leaned toward the pastor and whispered something. The pastor nodded, then announced, "And now, Richard's grandson, Daniel, would like to say a few words." My heart dropped. I hadn't prepared a speech. No one had asked me this. Was the setup a trap? They wanted to see me stumble, to embarrass myself in front of the entire room? My mother squeezed my hand, her eyes pleading. "You don't have to," but it was too late. All eyes were on me. I rose slowly, my legs heavy as stone. The whispers grew, subtle but sharp. What could he possibly say? This should be good. Standing at the podium, I stared at the sea of expectant faces, some fake sympathy, others thinly veiled amusement. My throat went dry. I opened my mouth. That's where I'll pause this first part of the story. I gripped the edges of the podium as if holding on for dear life. My palms were slick, and the microphone squealed faintly as I adjusted it. The congregation stared back at me, waiting. Some eyes softened with pity, others sharpened with amusement. My cousins leaned forward in their seats, their lips twitching, as though they were waiting for a punchline. I cleared my throat. My voice cracked when I began. Grandpa." I paused, already hearing a faint chuckle from the second row. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength. He was always someone I admired. He taught me things I don't think anyone else noticed. Used to give me books, history, philosophy, even novels. And he told me I swallowed hard. My mind flashed back to those quiet moments when Grandpa would hand me a worn paperback. With a little smile, he told me not to let anyone convince me I was less than what I was. He believed. He believed I had strength in me even when I didn't see it myself. For a brief second, the room was silent. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd managed to speak from the heart in a way that mattered. But then Clara leaned into Lydia and whispered something loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Guess Grandpa never gave him business advice. It's just bedtime stories. Laughter broke out in their row, stifled but audible. A ripple of mockery that spread like wildfire. I froze. My ears burned, my cheeks flushed crimson. Someone in the back, I think it was Andrew, coughed and muttered, "Pathetic." The pastor cleared his throat, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The air had shifted. What should have been a sacred farewell had turned into a stage for ridicule. My lips trembled as I tried to continue. Grandpa, he meant a lot to me. And even if suddenly Uncle Thomas's booming voice interrupted from his pew, "Thank you, Daniel, that was heartfelt." The way he said it dripped with condescension, the kind of tone you'd use to dismiss a child's crayon drawing. I knew I couldn't win. I muttered a quiet thank you and stepped down, my vision blurred by unshed tears. My legs felt like they weighed 100 pounds as I returned to my seat. My mother squeezed my hand again. "You did fine," she whispered. But I didn't believe her, could still hear the faint chuckles echoing in my head. After the service, we gathered in the church hall for the reception. Tables lined with casseroles, sandwiches, and trays of pastries awaited the mourners. But the atmosphere was less about grief and more about performance. My relatives swarmed together in little groups, laughing, reminiscing, praising one another for their speeches. I sat alone with a paper plate of food I couldn't bring myself to eat. Every bite tasted like cardboard anyway. Clara eventually strutted over, her heels clicking on the tile. She leaned on the table beside me, arms crossed. "That was brave of you," she said, her tone insincere, standing up there with nothing to say. "I mean, I guess it's sweet that you had your little moments with Grandpa. Books and all that. Very quaint." Her smirk widened. "But, he wanted us to be leaders. He wanted us to carry the Carter name with pride. And I don't think he meant quoting fairy tales." Lydia and Grace appeared behind her, snickering. "Yeah," Lydia added. "I almost cried when you said he believed in you. Almost. But then I thought, wow, that must have been out of pity." They erupted into laughter. I felt the heat rising in my chest again. Words swirled in my head, sharp retorts begging to escape. But every time I tried to speak up, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood and walked away. Near the coffee table, I overheard Uncle Thomas speaking with Margaret. "Father knew who the real torchbearers were," he said proudly. "He trusted me with the business for a reason. Daniel, well, poor boy. He doesn't have the spine. Can you imagine him running a company? He'd crumble within a week." Margaret chuckled, sipping her tea. "He'll probably end up as a clerk somewhere. Maybe a teacher if he's lucky. That's all he's built for." They didn't even lower their voices. I clenched my jaw so tight I thought my teeth might crack. Later, Aunt Sylvia gathered a circle of her friends, her voice carrying across the hall. "Of course, Daniel gave a little speech," she said, feigning sympathy. "It was touching in its own way, but it reminded me of when he was a boy, always tagging along, always trying to belong. Richard did his best with him, but some branches just don't grow strong, Her friends nodded solemnly, like she was delivering some profound truth. I wanted to scream, to tell them they had no idea who I was, no idea what I'd been through, no idea of the quiet strength I'd carried all these years. But I stayed silent, letting their words sink into me like knives. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself outside, standing in the rain just to escape the suffocating air inside. My mother joined me, holding an umbrella. "They'll never change," she said softly. "But you don't need their approval." I nodded, though my chest still ached. "It's like, no matter what I do, it's never enough for them." She looked at me, her eyes kind. "It doesn't have to be. One day, Daniel, the truth will come out. And when it does, you won't have to say a word. They'll see." I didn't know what she meant at the time, but her words lingered with me, even as I tried to shake off the humiliation of that day. The breaking point came during the dinner that evening at Uncle Thomas's house. The family gathered again, this time in his sprawling mansion, its walls lined with portraits of ancestors who stared down at us with stern eyes. The long dining table groaned under platters of food, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. As I sat near the end of the table with my mother, the conversations flowed above me like I wasn't there. Discussions of investments, promotions, vacations abroad, all things I had no part in. At one point, Andrew raised his glass. "To Grandpa," he said. We honor him by carrying the Carter legacy with strength and excellence." Everyone echoed the toast. Glasses clinked. Then Clara smirked and added, "And may we never forget his greatest lesson, to aim high and never settle for mediocrity." Her eyes flicked toward me, and the table erupted in laughter. The laughter spread like wildfire, filling the room. Even Aunt Sylvia slapped the table, cackling. Uncle Thomas chuckled into his wineglass. And there I was, sitting at the far end, their target once again. I felt like the walls were closing in. My chest tightened, my vision blurred with rage and shame. My mother reached for my hand under the table, but it wasn't enough to soothe the storm raging inside me. I'd never felt so small, so humiliated. It wasn't just laughter, it was dismissal, rejection, erasure. And I'll never forget that moment, because it was the last time they ever laughed at me like that. Because none of them, not Thomas, not Clara, not Sylvia, had any idea what was coming. I didn't know that Grandpa had left behind more than memories. He had left behind secrets, and soon the lawyer would speak. The laughter at Uncle Thomas's table still rang in my ears when the doorbell chimed, a sound so polite it felt obscene in that echoing dining room. Conversation paused. A maid hurried through the archway and returned, with a man I'd only seen once in a faded photograph on Grandpa's study shelf. He carried a leather briefcase and the kind of stillness that makes a crowded room go quiet on instinct. Silver hair, dark suit, rain still jeweling the shoulders. "Good evening," he said, voice smooth as old mahogany. "I'm Graham Halvorson, Richard Carter's attorney." The clink of flatware died. Clara's smile thinned. Uncle Thomas rose halfway from his chair, then seemed to think better of it and sat down again. "We weren't expecting," Aunt Sylvia began, but he held up one palm, courteous. "I won't take much of your time," he said. Mr. Carter left very specific instructions for the hours following his funeral. He asked that I read an initial letter to family only. He glanced around the table, his eyes pausing on me. Then on my mother beside me. "That's agreeable. We can begin." A current passed through the room. Curiosity, irritation, a tremor of something like fear. Thomas fixed his cufflinks with theatrical calm. "Course," he said. "Let's move to the library." We filed out of the dining room like school children called to assembly. In the corridor, mirrors caught our faces in slices Margaret's. Pinched, Sylvia's powdered and pearly, Clara and Lydia whispering behind their hands. I followed at the end of the line, my mother's fingers pressed around my forearm, an anchor. The library smelled like cedar and old paper. Rain thudded a slow heartbeat against the tall windows. Over the fireplace, a portrait of my grandfather watched us gather. His painted eyes had that same amused sternness I remembered from childhood, as if he could see through every performance and into the marrow of things. Mr. Halvorson placed his briefcase on the desk and opened it with two understated clicks. From inside, he withdrew a sealed cream-colored envelope and a small black device I recognized with a jolt, a digital voice recorder. He didn't sit. He remained standing, as if he understood that the gravity would be better delivered from his full height. "Before we proceed," he said, "Mr. Carter asked me to confirm who is present. Eldest son, Thomas Carter. Middle child, Sylvia Carter Westcott. Surviving spouse of the late Jonathan Carter." He inclined his head gently toward my mother, Elaine. "Carter, grandchildren, Clara, Andrew, Lydia, Grace." His gaze found me at last, held, and Daniel Carter. Something tightened in my chest. My name echoed differently in his mouth, not as an afterthought, but as a point. Aunt Sylvia fluttered a hand. Yes, we're all here." "Is there a reason this can't wait until the formal reading?" "There is," he said, and broke the seal. He unfolded a single page, cleared his throat, then read in a measured voice that was unmistakably not his own. "To my family, if Mr. Halvorson is with you, it means I have left the church and been laid to rest. I know you're gathered near the old books I used to brag about never having time to read." I never said this enough aloud. "Thank you for coming, Richard." I felt my throat pinch. The room shifted, backs straightened, breaths caught. Hearing Grandpa's name written so simply felt like a hand on my shoulder. Halvorson read on. "We will have the formal reading of my last will and testament tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Halvorson and King, as required. I asked for this early letter because some things cannot be said under oath without turning into performance. Think of this as a father and grandfather speaking plainly." The corner of Thomas's mouth twitched. Performance. He heard it too. "First, to my eldest, Thomas, you have carried the company's weight for many years. To my daughter Sylvia, you have carried our family's gossip for just as many. Both are heavy loads. Both have a cost. Second, to the grandchildren, you are my greatest experiment. If you rolled your eyes just now, I forgive you. If you were raised in a house that made competition sound like oxygen, I bear some blame for that. I wanted you hard enough to survive the world. I forgot to make you soft enough to remain human. I regret it. A faint, startled sound escaped Margaret. It could have been a laugh, but wasn't. I stared at the carpet. Pattern so I wouldn't cry. Third, to my youngest son's boy, Daniel. You were the only person who ever asked me who I was before I was Richard Carter. You asked what scared me. Elevators, by the way. Never liked them. You asked if I ever wanted to leave the town I helped build. Yes, often. You asked if I believed in luck. I do. I think it favors those who refuse to mock the unlucky. My vision blurred. A heat swam up behind my eyes with nowhere to go. Sylvia shifted noisily in a chair. Is there a point to Mrs. Westcott? Halverson said mildly, lowering the page. I will complete the letter as instructed. You will have full opportunity to speak after. His politeness had the sharp edge of a paper cut. He lifted the page again. There are 2 envelopes in my attorney's briefcase. The first is to be opened only if there was laughter today. Graham, if you heard it, I trust your judgment. If there was no laughter, open the second instead. An electric silence fell. I could hear the rain and beneath it, my own pulse. Mr. Halverson didn't reach for either envelope yet. He let the weight of the words hover. Then he drew a slow breath, slid the first envelope free, the one that read in Grandpa's block letters, if there was laughter, and broke the seal with his thumb. My stomach dropped to the floor. Clara's hand flew to her throat. Ridiculous. Everyone laughs at a funeral. Okay? It relieves tension. Not at someone, my voice said before I could stop it. Thin, raw. Her eyes flashed. Halvorsen began to read. If you're hearing this, then someone laughed. I ask for this clause because I know my family's worst impulse. We confuse cleverness with cruelty. We confuse dominance with leadership. We confuse embarrassment with justice. If you've laughed at my funeral, understand 2 things. 1, I expected it and built my final act accordingly. 2, I am not angry. I am finished teaching with hints, Aunt Sylvia sputtered. What sort of? He continued. Graham will play a short recording now. Forgive the paranoia. Age taught me to stop pretending I didn't know how I was raising you. He set the page down, lifted the small black device, and pressed. Play. The first sound was a scrape of chairs, then the distinct murmur of the church hall. I knew the moment because the acoustics were identical to the minutes after my stammering eulogy. On the recording, my voice trembled, even when I didn't see it myself. A whisper slid across the speakers. Clara, unmistakable. Guess? Grandpa never gave him business advice. It's just bedtime stories. Laughter followed Lydia, Grace, Andrew, others. A ripple of cruel delight. Then, clear as crystal, Andrew's underbreath. Pathetic. The room we stood in now seemed to fall forwards, everyone lurching a fraction toward the sound. I tasted metal on my tongue. Then came the dinner toast. Andrew's glass, the clink, Clara's addendum. May we never forget his greatest. Lesson 2, aim high and never settle for mediocrity. The laughter again, broader this time. My humiliation captured like a specimen under glass. Mr. Halverson clicked the recorder off. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Thomas spoke, his voice too loud. That proves nothing. Gallows humor, your father anticipated your framing, Halverson said. He chose his words precisely. He raised the letter again. A will can create conditions, and I have done so. Graham will explain the particulars tomorrow, but in brief, the Carter holding assets are placed in a trust. Disbursements to each of you depend on decorum during the mourning period, specifically the absence of ridicule toward any family member by any other. You failed that today. The trust has automatic triggers. Margaret made a strangled sound, like metal on metal. Automatic, what does that mean? It means your shares convert, Halverson said calmly, to a non-voting class for a term of 7 years, renewable, with distributions capped at cost of living adjustments. Control of voting shares and stewardship of the philanthropic arm transfers to the trust's primary trustee, which is me, Thomas said quickly. Recovering, obviously. No, Halvorsen said, and the word hit the room like a stone dropped into a shallow pond. It isn't. He reached into the briefcase again and lifted another envelope. This one already open, edges worn as if handled many times. On the front, trustee letter to be read only if Clause 1 triggers. He read Primary Trustee Daniel Carter, Alternate Elaine Carter. Rationale: Daniel knows the difference between winning and being worthy. I have let the rest of you win for so long you can no longer tell the difference. I didn't realize I had stepped backward until my shoulder met a bookcase. The room tilted. My mother's hand found mine and gripped. Clara laughed, a small, disbelieving gasp. No, that's absurd. He's not qualified. Qualification is addressed, Halvorsen said. Mr. Carter required his primary trustee to seek counsel from a named advisory board for 12 months. Auditors. Legal, the Philanthropic Foundation's director. He anticipated the need for mentoring. He did not view that as a weakness. Thomas moved toward the desk, color rising in his neck. This is a stunt. My father would never hand over his life's work to your brother's son, Elaine said quietly, and the strength in her voice startled even me, too. The person you taught yourselves to despise because it made you feel safe. Thomas glared at her. You have always resented. Stop, I said, surprising myself again. All of you. Just let him finish. I couldn't hear my pulse anymore. The room had narrowed to the paper in the lawyer's hand. He obeyed, eyes skimming the page before he resumed. For decades, I allowed Thomas to believe that the business was a test he alone could pass. That was my failing. He is competent, and I am grateful. But competence without character is a storm in a locked room. It only demolishes what it cannot escape. Sylvia sank into a chair as if her knees had loosened. Richard wrote that. Yes, Halvorsen said. All of it. There is one more matter, he read. I have stored documents and recordings related to the period preceding Jonathan's death, for reasons I won't explain in a letter. Those are to be opened by the trustee only after the formal reading, and only if the trigger you heard today occurred. If no laughter occurred, those would be destroyed unopened. If you are hearing them, well, it means I failed to heal what I started. The truth will do the job I refused to do. Graham, provide the key. Mr. Halvorsen reached inside the briefcase and lifted a small black fob on a thin brass chain. He didn't hand it to me yet. He looked at the room, took in the widened eyes, the shifting bodies, the desperation beginning to sharpen around the mouths of the people who had always had enough. Thomas's voice dropped an octave, oily with persuasion. Graham, you and I go back years. This kind of clause will invite litigation for sport. My father hated mess. He hated cowardice more, Halvorsen said gently. I could feel something unknotting in my spine, each vertebrae reminding me it was there. It had always been there. My humiliation from an hour earlier began to erode, not vanish but dissolve around the edges like sugar in hot water. Sylvia clapped her hands once, brittle, so we're punished because a few children snickered. That is not justice. That is sentimentality with a power complex. Her daughters' faces drained at children. Halvorsen shook his head, not because of laughter itself, because of what it revealed. Mr. Carter was meticulous. He did not wish to die wondering whether he had built a family or a court. He turned a final page. If you're angry, I understand. If you feel betrayed, ask yourself whom you betrayed today. If you are thinking, he's forcing the meek to rule us, I have two thoughts. One, the meek don't rule, they steward. The dictionary defines meekness as power under control. I found precious little of that today. The words hung there like a bell tone, shimmering. Thomas tried laughter. It wobbled. So, Daniel becomes king because we laughed? No, I said. The certainty surprised me with its calm. What? King-keeper. Heads turned. The word felt like it had stepped out of me without asking permission. Halvorsen folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope with the unhurried care of a man putting away a weapon. "There is a small addendum," he said. Mr. Carter left a personal message, in his own voice. He asked that it be played if the first clause triggered. Okay, I can play it now or tomorrow. Your choice. My mouth was paper dry. Now I heard myself say, he pressed play again. Grandpa's voice filled the library, warm, worn, entirely present. "Hello, you ornery lot." A breath that was almost a laugh. "If you're hearing me, something went wrong today." Maybe it went exactly as I suspected. "Thomas, sit down. You're pacing." "Sylvia, stop talking over me. I promise you'll get your turn at lunch in whatever afterlife I've been assigned." A rustle of paper. "This is the last gift I'll give. A story I should have told when your brother died. Jonathan left the company not because he was weak, not because he was a dreamer, but because he found a ledger that didn't add up, he told me. We investigated quietly. It led to a partner I brought in early, my mistake, who'd been siphoning small amounts that grew large. We resolved it quietly because my pride couldn't bear the public stain. Jonathan left because he couldn't bear the private stain, my decision to keep it quiet. He said, 'Dad, you're teaching us to protect the name even when the truth needs a microphone.' He was right. We went hunting different lives after that. He died before I could say he was right. I am saying it now." The rug moved under my feet. I reached for the desk. Grandpa's voice took on that flinty softness he used when he told me how to sand a piece of wood, firm, tender. "Thomas, your competence saved us for years. You also learned the wrong lesson, that the brand must be bulletproof at all costs. I trained that reflex. I regret it. Sylvia, your talent for reading people became a pastime of judging them. I trained that, too. I regret it. As for the grandchildren, Clara, you confused quick wit with intelligence. Lydia and Grace, your beauty made rooms easy. Do you think a door opening means you're owed the building? Andrew, you equate volume with strength. These are caricatures, not sentences. You can redraw them. I hope you will. And Daniel, kiddo, I'm sorry for standing by when a pack circled you. I wanted you to grow a hide. You grew a heart. Instead, I should have had the courage to demand that from everyone. The recording clicked off. No one spoke. The rain pressed its face to the windows like a curious child. Inside me, a plank I'd been standing on my whole life gave a small, decisive crack. Not from collapse, but from loosening, like something old finally pried free. Thomas moved again, slower this time, as if wading through a thicker room. You expect me to accept a tape and a letter that appear out of nowhere, overturning decades of succession because Father decided to play riddles at the end? That's not a riddle, I said, surprised again by the steadiness in my voice. It's a mirror. His eyes snapped to mine. For the first time, I saw not disdain, but calculation shading into uncertainty. He wasn't looking at the boy he'd pushed to the edge of the family portrait. He was looking at the man standing inside the frame. Tomorrow, Halvorsen said, closing the briefcase, we'll read the will in full. You'll see the trust documents, the advisory board, the charitable mandates, the compliance audits, the no contest clause. Clara flinched. No contest. Yes, he said. Anyone who files to overturn without, 'cause forfeits distributions entirely for the term. Your father wanted disputes brought to the board first, then mediated. He learned from that old scandal he just confessed. Silence again? Different now. Not the stunned kind. The kind that follows the first peal of thunder when everyone calculates how close the storm sits and how long it plans to stay. Aunt Sylvia rallied first, because of course she did. Well, she said brightly, this is all very theater. Tomorrow we'll discover it's less dramatic than advertised and we'll simply carry on as we should. Daniel, darling, I'm sure you'll be wonderful at what was the word? Stewarding. Such a humble word. Suits you. Her smile cut like a ribbon pulled too tight. Lydia and Grace laughed on cue, thin, unreliable. But the laughter was different now. It didn't fill the room. It didn't stick. Skittered against the walls and slid to the floor, unwanted. I looked up at the portrait over the mantel. The painted light, Grandpa's eyes glinted with that familiar dare. What will you do now? I'd spent years swallowing replies. Tonight, I felt an answer rise that belonged to me. I'd like to see his study, I said. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't permission-seeking. Simply was. Halverson nodded as if I had opened a door he'd been standing beside. Your grandfather left one more instruction. Daniel is to retrieve a box from the safe, tonight, with me present. The key I hold unlocks it. The contents go to the trustee. Provisionally to you with your mother as witness. Thomas exhaled a frustrated laugh. In my house. Absolutely not. That safe is in your father's house, I said. The words quiet but crisp. For tonight. We stood there, the two of us, the two lives my grandfather had tried to build, the two lessons he'd accidentally taught. Thomas's jaw moved as if grinding something too tough to swallow. Then, with a stiff nod so small it could have been a tick, he gestured toward the hallway. Sway, he said. We filed past the dining room where the candles guttered in pools of wax, the ghost of our earlier laughter clinging to the wainscoting like smoke. Past the gallery of oil portraits. Past the grandfather clock that had outlived 3 renovations and 2 marriages. At the end of the hall, Thomas opened the study door. The room welcomed me in the way only a place that remembers your smallness. Can that old leather chair by the window? The globe with the tiny nick in the South Atlantic. The shelf where Grandpa kept the books he gave me. Marcus Aurelius, Baldwin, a tattered copy of The Old Man and the Sea with graphite underlines that sometimes matched my own. Thomas crossed to the painting on the north wall, a somber seascape, and swung it outward on hidden hinges. Behind it, the safe's polished dial blinked out of the frame like the pupil of a sleeping animal. He turned the dial with practiced efficiency and opened the door. Inside, stacked files crouched like obedient cats. A small, weathered cedar box sat on the shelf, tied with twine faded almost to gray. Halverson stepped forward, producing the brass fob. It matched the tiny lock on the cedar. He offered it to me. The metal was warm from his palm when it touched mine. It felt too light to hold the weight it carried. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a delicate click, a tiny throat clearing. Inside, wrapped in parchment, like a gift from an older century, lay 3 items. A slim leather notebook, a flash drive sealed in tamper-evident plastic, and a folded page with my name, in my grandfather's unmistakable hand. Daniel. My mother took a breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for 12 years. I unfolded the page. Kiddo, if you're reading this, it means I lacked the courage to do this face to face. Forgive me that, if you can. The notebook is mine from the months after your father died. You will find the ledger pages Jonathan found. My notes, names. I should have said aloud. The drive contains recordings, meetings, calls, the partner's confession. You will also find something harder. A list of times I watched you be belittled and did not intervene. I wrote them to remind myself what I was choosing when I told myself I was keeping peace. A man should know the price of his choices. Use what's here if you must. Don't if you don't. I am not asking for spectacle. I am asking for truth. Give the truth a microphone and then let it speak, even if it embarrasses the name. If you do that, I will be proud in whatever place I am. Grandpa. My hands shook so badly the paper rustled like leaves. I wanted to cry and run and sleep and scream. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the box as if tucking in a child. Behind me, I could feel my cousins craning, their curiosity blooming into fear and then into anger. The room's oxygen changed. Thomas stepped closer, stopping 2 feet away, his voice soft enough that only I heard it. You are not ready for this, he said. And our name cannot survive another scandal. I met his eyes for what felt like the first real time in my life. Maybe it shouldn't, I said. Not the name as you know it. A flicker surprise, then something grudging that might one day learn to be respect. Then the old, hard gleam returning like a reflex. We'll see, he said. We will, I agreed, and turned back to Halvorsen. Tomorrow at 10. He nodded. Tomorrow at 10. We left the study in a procession that felt nothing like the one that had entered the house seemed to watch us pass, taking notes. In the foyer, our umbrellas leaned like sentries by the door. Rain still came down, unbothered by family drama. As my mother and I stepped onto the porch, Clara's voice floated after us, brittle with forced lightness. "Sleep well, trustee," she said. "Try not to dream of bedtime stories." I paused, half-turned. "I'll be dreaming of ledgers," I said, "and microphones." The door closed behind us with a soft, expensive thud. Out in the rain, under the halo of the porch light, my mother's face looked younger, or maybe just less braced. She slipped her arm through mine. "Oh. You okay?" she asked. "No," I said honestly. I felt wrung out, hollowed, alive. But I think I will be. She nodded, as if that was the answer she'd been waiting years to hear. We walked to the car together, the rain stitching a new kind of silence between us. Not the silence of swallowing words, but the silence of gathering them. Tomorrow would bring signatures and clauses and the kind of war that ends names or remakes them. Tonight brought only one thing: the end of their laughter's echo. Grandpa had given truth, a microphone. I was learning where to place it. The next morning felt heavier than the rain that still blanketed the town. My suit was still damp from the night before, but I wore it anyway. Something about the weight of the water clinging to the fabric felt like armor, like I was carrying the residue of what had been washed away. My mother sat beside me in the car as we drove to Halvorsen and King, the law firm where the formal reading would take place. She was quiet, but her hand rested on mine. The whole way, her presence grounding me. I knew she was thinking of Dad, of how he'd never lived to see this moment. How he'd tried to warn Grandpa about the cracks forming in our family long before anyone else. By the time we pulled up to the granite-faced building downtown, the rest of my family was already there. Their cars, sleek, foreign, expensive line, the street like a parade of vanity. Swallowed hard and reminded myself of Grandpa's words. "Don't let them break you, Daniel." Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Uncle Thomas stood near the head of the table, puffed up like a general preparing for battle. Aunt Sylvia whispered furiously to Lydia and Grace, their eyes darting toward me as though I were a trespasser in their kingdom. Clara twirled a diamond bracelet around her wrist, the gesture casual but her eyes sharp. Measuring, Mr. Halvorsen entered with deliberate calm, carrying a stack of documents. He placed them neatly on the table, then gestured for everyone to sit. The leather chairs creaked as we complied. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Yesterday evening, as instructed by the late Richard Carter, I read a preliminary letter and played a recording. Today we move to the formal reading of his will and testament, as well as the terms of the Carter Trust." Uncle Thomas immediately leaned forward. "Before we begin, I must state for the record that my father's mental state in his final months." Halvorsen raised one brow, silencing him with nothing more than that small movement. Mr. Carter's mental faculties were affirmed by 3 separate physicians within the last 6 months of his life. Any challenge on grounds of competency will invoke the no contest clause. The words landed like a hammer. Thomas sat back, his jaw clenched. Halvorsen unfolded the will and began. "I, Richard Carter, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this my last will and testament. To my children, Thomas and Sylvia, I leave personal effects, heirlooms, and mementos of our family history. To my grandchildren, Clara, Andrew, Lydia, and Grace, I leave a modest inheritance for personal use. However, the bulk of my estate, including Carter Holdings, Charitable foundations and associated properties will be held in trust under the stewardship of my grandson, Daniel Carter." The room erupted. Clara slammed her hand on the table. "This is insane." Lydia's voice cracked into a shriek. "He's the least qualified of us all." Andrew muttered something foul under his breath. Aunt Sylvia fanned herself, her face pale with outrage. Richard must have been manipulated. "There's no other explanation." Halvorsen cleared his throat. "There is." Mr. Carter anticipated these objections and addressed them directly in his letter. He read again from the document. "Some of you will say Daniel is unprepared. That is why I have surrounded him with advisors and mandated transparency. Some will say he is unworthy. That is why I chose him. Worthiness is not about polish or pedigree. It is about truth. And Daniel has carried truth like a scar. Scars are qualifications." I felt every eye in the room burning into me. My heart pounded, but I lifted my chin. Uncle Thomas leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "Do you understand what this means, boy? You'll ruin everything. Do you don't know the first thing about running a business?" For the first time, I didn't flinch. I met his stare. Head on. Maybe I don't know everything. I know the difference between building something and bleeding it dry. And I won't let this family's name mean cruelty anymore. Clara laughed bitterly. "You think you're some kind of savior? You were the joke of this family. You still are. Grandpa just felt sorry for you." "Then why?" I asked, my voice steady. "Did he give me the microphone?" Her smirk faltered. Halvorsen tapped the cedar box I had retrieved the night before. "There are materials your grandfather left that clarify his decision. Mr. Carter requested they be revealed only if the first clause of his will triggered. As it did, I am now authorized to disclose them." He pulled out the notebook, the flash drive, and the written list Grandpa had prepared. These documents detail a financial scandal from decades ago. Richard Carter and his son Jonathan. Daniel's father uncovered it together. Jonathan insisted on exposing it, but Richard chose silence to protect the Carter name. That silence caused Jonathan to leave the company. These files reveal everything: siphoned funds, falsified records, and the cover-up. The room exploded again. Sylvia gasped dramatically. "That's ancient history." Thomas's face turned red, veins standing out in his temples. "You can't drag our name through the mud over something that was resolved years ago." Halvorsen's gaze was steel. "The no contest clause prevents you from stopping it. If Daniel chooses to disclose these, the law is on his side." All eyes turned to me. The weight of generations pressed on my shoulders. I thought of Grandpa's words, "Give the truth a microphone." I took a deep breath. "I will." I didn't read the notebook word for word. Instead, I summarized calmly, clearly, without malice. My father discovered the theft. He wanted it stopped openly, but Grandpa covered it up. That decision drove my father away and left me fatherless when the rest of you mocked his choices. Grandpa admitted his regret, and he left me the chance to finish what he couldn't. I looked directly at Thomas. "The Carter name won't mean deception anymore. It will mean accountability." The silence was deafening. Aunt Sylvia shifted in her seat, muttering, "You'll ruin us." "No," I said firmly. "You ruined yourselves when you chose pride over truth. I'm just pulling the curtain back." Halvorsen leaned forward. "As trustee, Daniel has the authority to direct the philanthropic arm of Carter Holdings. His first act may very well be transparency." The fury in Thomas's face told me I had already begun. Later that afternoon, a press release went out. Under Halvorsen's supervision, it announced both Grandpa's death and the transfer of Carter Holdings stewardship. But more importantly, it included a statement, my statement. "The Carter family has long prided itself on strength and success. My grandfather, Richard Carter, believed in truth above all, even when it was hard to face. Today, I honor him by acknowledging past mistakes and committing to a legacy built not on pride, but on honesty and accountability. The Carter Trust will continue to serve the community with transparency at its core. When the statement hit the media, the story spread like wildfire. Local news picked it up, then regional outlets. Suddenly, the Carters weren't being praised. For their wealth, they were being scrutinized for their arrogance and hypocrisy. And while the press praised my courage, my relatives couldn't step outside without whispers following them. Their polished reputations cracked under the weight of Grandpa's truth. The next family dinner was canceled. Weeks later, Clara sent a text dripping with venom. "Hope you're enjoying your little throne. Don't forget you're still the outsider." I didn't reply. Because the truth was, I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. For the first time, I felt like myself, and their humiliation. That wasn't my revenge. It was Grandpa's justice. The laughter that had haunted me for years had finally died in their throats. And in its place, there was silence. A silence that belonged to me. When the noise of the lawyers, the news, and the furious phone calls finally quieted, I found myself sitting in Grandpa's old study again. The rain had stopped by then, and a faint evening light cut through the heavy curtains, painting the shelves in muted gold. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt still. I ran my fingers across the spines of his books, the ones he used to press into my hands. They weren't just paper and ink anymore. They were proof that he had seen me, believed in me, even when everyone else looked through me. And I realized something: revenge wasn't the prize here. Justice had already been delivered. What remained was something quieter, but infinitely more powerful: freedom. In the days that followed the will's reading, the family fractured. Aunt Sylvia stopped calling. Clara, Lydia, and Grace deleted their social media accounts after the news coverage turned them into symbols of arrogance. Uncle Thomas vanished. Into his office, no longer striding through the world like a king, but lurking in the shadows of his diminished power. For once, I wasn't the one being avoided. They were the ones hiding from me. My mother asked one evening, as we sat at the kitchen table over mugs of tea, "Does it feel the way you thought it would?" I thought about that for a long time. "No," I admitted. "It feels heavier, but also lighter. Like I've been carrying their laughter for years, and now I've set it down. But in its place, there's this responsibility. I can't just prove them wrong. I have to prove Grandpa right." She reached across the table, covering my hand. "That's exactly what your father would have wanted." Stepping into the role of trustee wasn't glamorous. It was paperwork, meetings, long hours of learning about legal structures and audits I'd never cared about before. But every time I wanted to give up, I heard Grandpa's voice in my head: power under control. I leaned on the advisory board he had arranged. I asked questions relentlessly. I refused to bluff when I didn't know something. Okay? And slowly, to my surprise, people respected that honesty. The philanthropic foundation became my first focus. Instead of hollow charity galas, I directed funds toward scholarships for kids like me, kids who were mocked, underestimated, overlooked. We started a literacy program in honor of Grandpa's books because it wasn't the company meetings that had shaped me. It was the quiet lessons in the margins of pages he'd underlined. And when the press asked me why I made those choices, I said simply, because no child should grow up thinking their worth is decided by the room they're laughed out of. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to reach my relatives. Clara tried to challenge me publicly once, giving an interview where she called me the charity case Grandpa pitied. But then, footage of the funeral laughter leaked again, this time viral, stripped of context, shared by strangers who knew cruelty when they heard it. Comments flooded in. Disgusting behavior at a funeral. No wonder Grandpa bypassed them. Daniel deserved better. Her words lost their bite when the world had already judged her actions. As for Uncle Thomas, he eventually approached me in private. He was thinner, older, stripped of the authority that once radiated from him. "You'll destroy the company if you keep exposing the past," he warned. No, I replied, calm. The company was already destroying itself. I'm just giving it a chance to be something new. For the first time, he had no response, just silence. And that silence felt louder than all the mockery I'd ever endured. One afternoon, months later, I visited Grandpa's grave alone. The grass had grown in fresh and green, and the headstone was simple, dignified. I crouched down, tracing the letters of his name. "Hey, Grandpa," I whispered. "I did it. Not perfectly, not without fear. But I stood where you told me to. I gave the truth a microphone." The wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint scent of lilacs. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I swear I felt his hand on my shoulder again. Steady, grounding, proud. Looking back, I realized the greatest twist of all wasn't the will or the trust or the exposure of the family's cruelty. It was that, through all their attempts to belittle me, they had accidentally prepared. Me, every insult, every laugh, every dismissal, had forged resilience. They thought they were breaking me down, but they were hardening me into the very person Grandpa knew I needed to be. The lesson was clear. Family can wound deeper than anyone else, but family can also teach, even if only by showing you who you refuse to become. And maybe the sweetest justice wasn't their humiliation, was my freedom from needing their approval ever again. So when people ask me how it felt to sit in that funeral, to hear the laughter, to endure the years of cruelty, I tell them this: it felt like drowning. But when the lawyer spoke, it felt like surfacing. I smile when I say it because I know Grandpa would have liked that image. The man who built a business but also gave a boy books. The man who couldn't save my father but tried to save me in the only way he knew how, with truth written down, waiting for its moment. And I like to think that when he heard that laughter echoing through the church, wherever he was, he smiled too, because he knew what was coming. Because in the end, the Carter family story wasn't about their laughter. It was about the silence after the silence that belonged to me.